Welcome, everybody. It is great to have Sarah Matthews back with us, former deputy press secretary during Donald Trump's first term. Sarah, great to see you again.
Yeah, great to be on the program again. Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk a little bit about what I find to be very disturbing news with regard to the clampdown on free speech. I consider myself a small L libertarian. And what I mean by that is not that I'm like a member of the Libertarian Party, but that on the kind of spectrum between authoritarianism and libertarianism, I tend to don't get government involved unless there's a really good reason to do so. And sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. And when I see now what's happened with Stephen Colbert, we now have learned about an instance of self-censorship where Jimmy Kimmel's show is now being effectively canceled. Suspended indefinitely is what they call it, but effectively canceled. We see palpable hostility to like when the late night hosts make jokes that are adversarial to Trump or whatever. Was this sort of like a topic of discussion within the press shop?
I think in regards specifically to late night hosts, I think Republicans are used to those late night hosts attacking them for years and years. This was something that predated Donald Trump's tenure in office. And so I think that's just become the new norm. And I do think that I'm not the biggest fan of Jimmy Kimmel. And so it's funny for me to now be defending him in this instance. But at the end of the day, these are comedians. And so I do think that they're entitled to make jokes. And whether you agree if it was in poor taste or not, or you agree with the contents of what he said, this wasn't necessarily something I think that was on the radar of the White House, at least when I was there in the first term. And I think, too, that the second term, they've become much more emboldened to go after these types of folks, whether it be news organizations or late night talk show hosts, you name it. I think that Trump now doesn't have any fear of going after these folks because he doesn't really have anything to lose. It's not like he has to worry about running for reelection again, even though I know he loves to go out there and float the idea of a third term. But I do think that he feels emboldened now to go after these people, to threaten them with lawsuits and to peer pressure them, as we saw the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, do with ABC specifically in this instance with Jimmy Kimmel. And so it is ironic though, because I think such a big part of being a conservative is being a constitutionalist and being an advocate for free speech. And so now to see the tables turn where they're going after people who they just don't like what they have to say. And so they're trying to silence their opposition. And that just goes to show how far American conservatism has eroded under Donald Trump, because he's taken everything of what it means to be conservative and kind of flipped it on its head. And so for this, with this example, it's really disheartening because I just don't even recognize the party that I used to be part of at one point. Or I
Yeah,
would say I'm still a conservative. I just think that the Republican Party has moved away from me.
well, the conservative perspective on this would land where I think the progressive perspective would land, which is keep the government out of this stuff. The conservatives, because they're against business regulation in principle sometimes, and the progressives, because they are not for limiting the speech of people, and parody, satire, and comedy and opinion are important forms of speech. And oftentimes, if we look over the last 150 years, sort of important for keeping those in power kind of in check. With regard to the actions of the media companies, are you surprised at the capitulation? Because we saw, Paramount settled because of, depending on, some combination of concerns about where the litigation would end and concerns about what might happen with their merger if they were to fight. So they said, we're gonna capitulate. 60 Minutes didn't agree with that, by the way, but that was the decision that Paramount made. With the Jimmy Kimmel show, it's totally preemptive. I mean, in other words, nothing had happened officially that we know of, but they decided, oh, because of this joke, which, by the way, like you point out, whether it's funny or not, it is a protected form of speech. They capitulated kind of like in advance. Are you surprised by the degree of capitulation that we're seeing?
I'm not surprised by the power grab by Donald Trump and his administration, but I have been surprised by the capitulation. And it goes across the board, whether it's the media companies that you just laid out, the big tech oligarchs, law firms, you name it. It is very disheartening to see people not fighting back. And this organization that I'm part of, it's called Home of the Brave. We are encouraging people to join us and speak their truth and talk about how the Trump administration has negatively impacted them, because it now rests on our shoulders. We, the people, have to be the ones fighting back. And I think I am encouraged to at least see that the New York Times seems to be pushing back with their reporting on the Epstein birthday letter that Trump wrote him, and they're being sued by Trump for it. And obviously, it's a frivolous lawsuit. I mean, look at the signature. We all know that this was written by Trump. And it's just because he wants to bury that story and doesn't want us to be talking about Epstein. But I'm encouraged to see that they're fighting back. But then when you look at all these other media companies, and it's not just them appeasing Trump, but as you noted, there are mergers at play. And so they're choosing the business decisions over protecting free speech and doing what's right for their programming. And so that is very disheartening.
One of the things that feels very different really over the last week or since the murder of Charlie Kirk, because of the reaction, not because of the murder itself, but because of the clampdown on speech kind of reaction from it, is I will only speak for myself, but I will say that the opinion is shared by a number of other creators in my cohort. We've all been in touch recently about it seems almost inevitable that they're going to try something with one of us. And it doesn't mean that it's going to get to the very top where it's Trump on Truth Social talking about Midas Touch or Brian Tyler Cohen. Not necessarily that, but that at some level, we have to assume either through a lawsuit or lawsuit threats or some at the platforms would be the other possibility. If in a month, when this meeting happens between the White House and some of the social media platforms, if the White House, I think, makes the platforms fear that they may be persecuted based on what opinion people say, I think the platforms will capitulate and they'll start clamping down on news and politics talk. So I'm very concerned that that is going to become a reality. Do you think it's a reasonable concern, or maybe we're low enough on the totem pole that it won't be a priority of the administration?
No, look, I mean, this is the new media. This is how people are mainly getting their news nowadays. And so I don't think that it's unreasonable to think that these kinds of platforms and shows will be targeted next. Look, their efforts have been effective. They've been able to get these bigger media organizations to capitulate. So I don't think that they have any reason to not want to extend that further, especially if they don't agree with the things that your show and other shows are espousing. And so they would want to silence that. And so I don't think it's unreasonable at all to assume that that could be the logical next step of their plan.
I see people in the comments saying that can't happen because of Section 230. That I think is that's a 2019 sort of reaction to this, because I think that although certainly that is the case and Section 230 is important, which relates to the platforms not being legally accountable for what people say, political pressure exists outside of Section 230. Influence campaigns, quid pro quos, or mergers that won't happen, or favorable treatment, or we're going to pull you all in for congressional hearings. All of that stuff is the kind of mob boss stuff that is outside of the law that this administration, I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, has shown themselves very willing to engage in.
Definitely. I think that Trump has demonstrated that type of behavior where he acts like a mob boss and then he sends out his cronies to go do his bidding. I mean, look, you had the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, doing just that and strong
Yeah.
arming ABC and the affiliate networks. And so I think that even though people say, oh, well, Section 230 would protect it, there's also been talk on Capitol Hill of repealing that. And
Yeah.
so whether it's they go down that avenue or, like as you outlined, there are plenty of other measures that they could take to strong arm these types of shows.
I want to talk a little bit about what's happening in the area you had direct experience, which is the press briefing apparatus of the Trump White House. We were promised that, unlike under Joe Biden, the press briefings would be regular and comprehensive and transparent. I don't have to give you examples of how that's not really happening, but we now have longer and longer stretches of time where there's no press briefing. Karoline Leavitt is just not out there. And we keep a close eye on that, again, because we're trying to hold accountable based on what was promised that they were going to do. Generally, we'll dig in specifically, but generally, what are the reasons why a White House press shop would start to spread out press briefings and do fewer of them? Like, what sorts of influences would get them to say, let's not brief today, let's not brief tomorrow?
It can definitely depend on what's going on in the news cycle. Obviously, the past several months, it has been dominated by Jeffrey Epstein news. And so I'm sure that that has played a hand at them going further and further in between having regularly scheduled press briefings. So that could certainly be it. I think, too, that sometimes when you're the press secretary, you're such a public facing role of the administration, and you're going to I feel like you're going to be on Donald Trump's radar a lot more than any other person in the administration. And so it's almost a protective measure, I would assume, too, where sometimes you don't want to be putting yourself out there in a situation where you're going to be asked tough questions and you could potentially make the boss look bad. And we know from based on his cabinet selections, he purposely picks people who are good on TV and he wants them out there. And so I'm sure that he wants them to be briefing more than they are, if I had to guess. I recall from my days at the White House when Kayleigh McEnany, who was the press secretary at the time, when she would go longer stretches without having press briefings, then he would see me in the hallway and say to me, we need to get Kayleigh out there. She needs to be briefing today. And it might have been a news day that we didn't want to be out there, or we had other things that we were prioritizing or focused on that day that we wanted to kind of carry the news cycle. And that could also be a play. I'll give them that, the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes there are things where you don't want to step on some other policy that you're pushing out, that and you don't want the news cycle to be swamped then by answering questions about Jeffrey Epstein. So I think there's a lot of things that go into it, but it is interesting that they kind of seem to have gone back on it, considering that they were so critical of the Biden administration's briefings, and they're not out there as frequently anymore.
Is it generally the case that if you feel you have things going on that you can speak positively about, that you would be incentivized to be out there? Like, would there be any reason not to be out there if you felt that today is a news day we can win?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely could be an incentivizing motivator to want to be out there to push positive news. I just think that as of late, it seems like a lot of the news surrounding them has been negative, whether it be the Jeffrey Epstein files, whether it be tariffs, the economy. It's all these things that aren't great for them to want to be out there talking about. And so they definitely should be out there if they have positive things to push. And beyond that, I think they should be out there in general because they owe it to the American people to provide answers to the questions that we have and that these journalists would be asking of them. And they claim to be the most transparent administration of all time, and yet they're not out there briefing. And I know that their pushback, because I can already picture it. What they would say is that, well, President Trump is the most accessible president of all time. So we don't need to be having as many briefings
Right.
because he'll answer the questions. And it's better coming from his mouth rather than a spokesperson's mouth. And that is true in a sense that, yes, he is accessible and will answer questions. But I do think, too, that you have a spokesperson for a reason, someone who can go a little bit deeper into questions. And the president doesn't have all day to sit there and answer questions. But guess what? It's the job of the White House press secretary to do just that, because he has other things that he needs to be focused on as well as the leader of the free world. And so that would be their pushback, I guess. I just know that's what they would say. But it's still not an excuse, and it doesn't seem all that transparent then if they're not having as many briefings.
What's your sense of what they want to talk about the least right now in terms of, is it about the free speech crackdown that they don't want to be asked about? Is it Trump's health and his right hand now? It's that weird patch of makeup now is the entire hand. It used to be a 1 inch square. Now it's the entire hand. We saw the video from the UK. Is it the Epstein lack of transparency? What is the main thing they don't want to talk about right now in your mind?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I would say it's a toss up between Epstein and his health, because obviously there's something going on with his health, and they have not been clear about what it is. And so it leads me to believe that there is something there. There's a story there, and they could simply put that to bed by just saying, "Oh, well, he bruised his hand doing X, Y, Z," but they're not doing that. And so it seems like there is some sort of cover up happening there. And then also with the Epstein files, I think they don't want to talk about that because it upsets their base. And that is what Trump is always concerned about the most, is keeping the base happy. And so them going back on their word that they were going to release these files, and him trying to downplay them, and now it's seeming like he's in the files and he's trying to say this is a hoax and all these other things. I think that they're worried about talking about that, not just because of many potential implications of him in those files, but I think too that they know that the more and more that that's in the news cycle, and their refusal to be transparent about it is just going to further upset their base.
In the last few minutes we have, I want to go into a little more detail about something we kind of touched on last time we spoke, but I'm curious your thoughts now. What is it that the folks that are sort of like more traditional Republicans actually have some conservative beliefs rather than these kind of neo-reactionary authoritarian views that we see from this administration? To the extent that you're in touch with folks kind of in that space, what does that group kind of want looking into 2028? Like, is Vance something that would who would be looked upon as better than Trump, or is Vance seen as basically more of the same thing, and the desire is for like a Thomas Massey or something like that? Like, what's that cohort kind of thinking right now?
Your question is about the kind of more traditional conservatives.
Yeah.
I think that Vance is seen as a tamer version of Trump, and so that does seem appealing in a lot of ways, where he is emulates a lot of Trump and his policies, and is seen a little bit like a disruptor and an outsider in a way. But then at the same time, he he kind of comes without all the baggage of Trump. And so I think that it would make sense naturally for him to be the successor if that's what you wanted. And I think that there are some conservatives out there who are happy with the Trump administration and the work that they've done in cracking down on immigration, for example. I think they like that. And so I think that they see Vance as a continuation of that. But I do think that there is a faction of folks who are hoping that maybe in 2028, there will be a competitive primary, and that we can shake things up and someone new might emerge. I think that I don't really, if I'm being a an optimist, I hope that it would be someone who's a little bit more of a more moderate Republican, but I just don't think there's an appetite for that in the party largely. And so I think that it's going to be a figure that it more closely is aligned in to Vance, whether it be a Josh Hawley kind of more populist. And I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I don't want it to be someone like that. I want us to start to revert back to more traditional conservatism. But I just think that the path that we're headed on, it really looks like that the party. I don't know if we'll ever go back, and so I hope I'm wrong. But I do think that they seem to be happy so far with the the way that Trump has kind of shaped the party and his image. And so I think most of those folks, honestly, will probably be on board with someone like a Vance, or even a Marco Rubio, who's obviously been a critical person in the second administration. So I think there's a lot of names that will be out there, but if Trump anoints a successor, it would be hard to, I think, beat them in a primary.
That seems for sure to be the case. We've been speaking with Sarah Matthews, former deputy press secretary in Donald Trump's first term. Also, check out Home of the Brave on all platforms, including also Substack. Sarah, always great to talk to you. Let's do it again.
Yes, thanks so much.
Take care. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Bye.